The United States Army once replaced an entire division of 30,000 soldiers with 1,100 artists, actors, and sound engineers, and the Germans never knew the difference. There is a version of military power that runs on steel and explosives, and the sheer physical weight of men and machines committed to a single purpose. And then there is a version that runs on something older and stranger, and in some ways more dangerous than all of that: illusion. The understanding that an enemy who believes something false will make decisions based on that false belief, and that those decisions, made confidently on incorrect information, can be as militarily decisive as any tank battle or artillery barrage ever fought. The United States Army understood this in theory. In 1944, they built a unit around it in practice. They called it the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. History would eventually call it the Ghost Army. And for over 40 years after the war ended, almost nobody knew it existed at all. The idea had a logic that was simple once someone stated it clearly. The German military intelligence system, the network of observation posts, aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, intercepted radio traffic, and human sources that fed information up the chain of command, was constantly trying to answer the same fundamental questions. Where are the Allied forces? How many of them are there? What are they planning to do next? If the answers coming back up that chain were wrong, if German commanders were looking at a picture of Allied dispositions that had been carefully constructed to mislead them, then every decision they made based on that picture would be wrong. You did not need to outfight a German division. You needed to make the German division go somewhere else. And to make the German division go somewhere else, you needed to convince the German commanders reading intelligence reports that the threat requiring their attention was over there rather than over here. The Ghost Army was the mechanism for creating that conviction. The men recruited into the 23rd were not typical soldiers. The Army's planners understood from the beginning that the skills required for what they had in mind were not skills the standard military training pipeline produced. They needed men who could think visually, men who understood how things looked from a distance, from the air, through binoculars, men who could construct a convincing illusion and maintain it under pressure, men who could improvise when the situation changed and still keep the deception coherent. They went to art schools, they went to advertising agencies, they went to theatre programs and design studios and the kind of creative environments where people spent their working lives thinking about how to make audiences believe things. What assembled in the summer of 1944 was one of the strangest collections of talent ever placed inside United States Army uniforms. Among the 1,100 men of the 23rd were painters who would later become significant figures in American art. Bill Blass, who would eventually build one of the most recognized names in American fashion, served in the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly, who became a major figure in abstract art, was there. Arthur Singer, who became famous for his wildlife illustrations. Designers, illustrators, set builders, men whose entire professional orientation was toward making things look convincing. They were handed inflatable rubber tanks and told to go fool the German army. The equipment the Ghost Army worked with sounds, in flat description, almost comedic. Rubber. Inflatable rubber tanks that could be pumped up by 2 men with a compressor in 20 minutes. Inflatable rubber artillery pieces. Inflatable rubber trucks and half-tracks and armored cars. The full visual vocabulary of a mechanized military unit reproduced in rubber and air. Deflated, they folded into packages that could be carried in the back of a truck. Inflated, they looked from the air, from the altitude of a German reconnaissance aircraft, like the real equipment of a real division. The illusion was not perfect. It did not need to be perfect. It needed to be convincing at the distance and angle from which German observers were likely to see it, from reconnaissance aircraft flying at altitude through the kind of hazy conditions that characterized much of the European weather in 1944 and 1945, A carefully positioned inflatable tank sitting in a tree line cast the right shadow, occupied the right space on a photograph, and told the German photo analyst looking at the print exactly what the Ghost Army needed him to believe. There were real tanks over here, large numbers of them, planning something. But the rubber was only one layer of the deception, and in many ways not the most important one. The Ghost Army operated across 4 distinct channels of deception simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others, each one designed to answer a different way that German intelligence might try to verify the picture being constructed. The first was the visual deception. The inflatable equipment, the vehicle tracks deliberately left in mud and dirt to suggest heavy movement, the carefully arranged positions that looked correct from above. The second was sonic deception. The army had developed, in collaboration with engineers and sound technicians, a system for playing recorded sounds through powerful speakers mounted on trucks. The recordings were precise and detailed, the specific sound signatures of different types of military equipment moving in different densities. A column of tanks moving at night sounded different from artillery being repositioned. An engineering unit building a bridge produced a specific acoustic signature. Infantry moving in large numbers sounded a specific way at specific distances. The Ghost Army's sound trucks could play these recordings at volumes that carried for distances of 15 miles or more in the right conditions. German soldiers in positions across rivers, behind hedgerows, in farmhouses being used as observation posts, men straining in the darkness to understand what was moving on the other side, heard exactly what the Ghost Army needed them to hear. Tanks, artillery, hundreds of vehicles, a major formation moving into position. The third layer was electromagnetic. Radio operators in the Ghost Army were specialists who had studied the specific radio signature of the units they were impersonating, not just the content of the messages, but the style. Every radio operator has individual characteristics in the way they send Morse code. A rhythm, a cadence, tiny habits that experienced listeners can identify as distinctly as a fingerprint. The Germans were listening. Their signals intelligence was sophisticated enough to track individual radio operators and build pictures of unit locations based on where those operators were transmitting from. The Ghost Army's radio operators learned to impersonate specific operators from the units they were replacing. They studied the habits, they copied the rhythms, they maintained fake traffic patterns that told German signals intelligence precisely what the deception required them to believe. The fourth layer was the most dangerous: theater. The Ghost Army sometimes operated within yards of German lines. Their men drove into local towns. They sat in cafes. They talked to French and Belgian civilians who they understood, because this was reality in 1944, might have conversations with German soldiers or German intelligence contacts within days of those interactions. They wore the patches of the units they were impersonating. They dropped the unit names into conversations. They left in places where they could be found the kind of small physical details, a supply manifest, a unit designation on a discarded envelope, that German intelligence treated as confirmation of what their other sources were telling them. This required something beyond the rubber tanks and the sound trucks and the radio operators. It required men willing to sit across a table from someone who might be reporting to the other side and maintain a performance convincingly enough to survive the scrutiny. They were soldiers, but in those moments they were operating as actors, and the stakes of a poor performance were not a bad review. The 23rd ran at least 21 separate deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany between the summer of 1944 and the end of the war in May 1945. Each one required a complete operational plan, not just the physical setup, but the intelligence picture it was trying to create, the German decision it was designed to influence, and the coordination with real Allied operations that the deception was meant to support. The scale of what they were replacing was extraordinary. In a single operation, 1,100 men, with their rubber equipment and their sound trucks and their radio operators and their theatre, would move into positions vacated by a real unit and simulate the presence of a force of 15,000 to 30,000 soldiers. The math is almost difficult to process. One man of the Ghost Army was doing the deceptive work of between 15 and 30 actual soldiers. And across 21 operations, those numbers compounded into something that military historians studying the unit after its declassification in 1996 found genuinely staggering. Operation Viersen in March 1945 was among the most consequential and the most dangerous. The objective was the Rhine crossing, one of the critical final operations of the European war. Allied forces were preparing to force the Rhine River in multiple locations, pushing into the German heartland for the drive toward Berlin. The Germans knew a crossing was coming. They did not know where.